All right, hello everybody. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program, Born in Blood, the beginning of the National Park System. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page. We ask the audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. Our next program is Mental Health with Henry Ford Health, which will be an in-person event on Thursday, May 15th. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Now, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Heather Bruegl.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? Cool. I do talk loud too, so don't worry about that. I am super excited to be here tonight to talk with you guys. First, I want to apologize if I am kind of leaning on the chair a little bit. I injured my left knee, so standing is fun. And so I'm kind of just taking that into consideration, but I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you guys. I have never been to Rochester Hills Library. I barely even come to Rochester because it's out of my way. So, but I'm really excited to be talking to you guys about this topic. If you love the national parks, I want you to keep loving the national parks. This is not to make you not love the national parks, but I'm somebody who firmly believes that there's a reason for things. As a historian, I look for the why, and I look to how something comes to be. And so that's what I'm talking to you about tonight, is the beginnings of the national parks and how they got to where they are and why we have them. I am a fan of national parks. I've gone to a few. I plan on going to some. My husband and I were thinking about going to some in September, but my schedule is getting a little crazy with my day job and other work that I'm doing, so that's not something that's going to be able to happen, but I have been to a couple. He's been to more than I have. When he was growing up, his family, they drove, his mom's from Arizona, so they would drive from Michigan back out west, and so he's been to like so many national parks, and I myself have not, because I'm not really an outdoorsy person, but I do like to go and see the beauty. So that's what I want to talk to you guys tonight, is about the national parks, the importance of why we have them, but more importantly, how they came to be and what's the Indigenous history behind them. This is something that is super important to myself as an Indigenous person, and we'll just talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to not talk super fast, but I want to get through the presentation quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time for conversation, for questions. Questions are my favorite part because I learn from you guys as well. If you guys ask a question that I've never even thought about before, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like something I haven't thought about. So with that, I'm going to dive into this and we'll go from there. I will try to speak as slowly as I can, but when I get excited about something, I tend to talk really fast, so sorry. I do want to start this evening off with a land acknowledgement. For me, land acknowledgements are super important. They are a way of entering into ceremony, letting the ancestors know we're talking about them and talking about, sorry, I had a cough drop in my mouth that I don't need anymore. Talking about Indigenous history and just honoring them. So I want to honor the Peoria, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Miami, Wyandot, and Fox nations. All of those nations have called Michigan home at one point in time or another. We acknowledge that through forced land cessions and removal, these nations were removed from the lands that they called home, and their seats of government are now in Canada, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and other parts of Michigan. Michigan's actually home to 12 federally recognized tribes. I think that's important to note. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present, and we understand that this acknowledgement is just the first step in building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. The photo on this slide is a photo that my husband took and it's of my favorite place in the whole wide world. It is from the Stockbridge Munsee Reservation, located in northern Wisconsin, about an hour west of Green Bay, very remote, really in the middle of nowhere. And this is my happy place. It's out in front of my uncle's cabin along the Red River. It's a place I go to when I need to regroup, when I need to just sit and listen to the river and cleanse. And so he took this photo for me, and so I like to share it with people because this is my happy place. And so I want you guys to think about what your happy places are. I feel like when I'm at this space, my uncle has since passed, but I feel like when I'm at this space, I feel him, I hear him, and I hear that encouragement that he gave me to pursue my passion of history and teaching. So that's my space. So think of your space. A little bit more about me. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I'm a first-line descendant, Stockbridge Munsee, which means I'm not enrolled in Stockbridge Munsee. My mother is, and there wasn't enough blood quantum for myself, my brother, my sister, and actually all of my first cousins to be enrolled in Stockbridge Munsee. We followed our grandmother's line, which is Oneida, and so we were able to enroll in Oneida. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work as a public historian, a consultant, a curator, a researcher, and I'm also a doctoral student, if I wasn't busy enough, at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, where I'm currently studying the importance of telling truth in history and making sure that cultural institutions and museums are doing that good work. My contact information is on the screen. Feel free to take a screenshot of it. Email me. I'm not super active on Twitter, but you can find me on there. Instagram, you can send me a DM, or you can just go to my website, which is just my first and last name .com, and you can find out more about the work that I do, but also upcoming talks. And I'm very good at denoting whether a talk is in person or it's virtual. That way, if it's if it's a talk that I'm talking about for an institution in New York, but it's something that you're interested in hearing, you'll see if that talk is virtual or not. And I always have links there where people can sign up to hear me, because I do talk about a number of different things. So there is all that information. Any other questions you can ask for me at the end. That'll be fine as well. So I want to talk about the Indigenous population. Why? Because it's important. So the Indigenous population of what would become the United States is anywhere between 5 to 15 million. By 1890, when the U.S. started to create the national parks, the population was around 250. You can see by the year 1900, it drops below 240,000. In 1491, so before 1492, Indigenous people controlled all of the 2.4 billion acres that would form the United States. That number is now just 56 million acres, which is about 2% of the land population within the United States. If you take the reservations in the United States, they will all fit in the state of Idaho. And at one point, the entire continent was Indigenous people. And so by 1990, the population was just below 2 million people. By 2013, the population was 5.2 million. And in 2021, the population was 9.7 million. And this is just those who participate in the census. There actually is a very big push on reservations when it is census year for people to do the census, to participate in it, so we know how many of us there are that are remaining. And again, we only take up about 2% of the land population. We're also only 2% of the people population. So in a continent that was ours, where we had villages and cities that rivaled some of the greatest cities in Europe, we're now only 2% of that population. And so that's something, regardless of what I'm talking about, I like to talk to people about, because there was a concentrated effort by the United States government to, quote, get rid of the Indian problem. And we can see it in our decline in population and where we stand now. So this is just something I wanted to cover with you. So we're here to talk about the national parks and the National Park Service. I have a number of friends who work in the National Park Service at various national parks. I have a good friend who works at the Ulysses S. Grant National Park, and he always tells some really cool stories about the people he encounters there. But I also wanted to create this timeline of the national parks and the National Park Service, dotted in with some other historical events that are going on, so we can see what's happening when we are creating, quote, these pristine lands, and what else is happening within the United States that also deals with indigenous people. So the Yellowstone Act, a National Park Act, was created in 1872. The act was signed into law on March 1st, establishing the world's first true national park. It withdrew more than 2 million acres of the public domain in the Montana and Wyoming territories from settlement, occupancy, or sale to be, quote, dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of people. It's placed under, the park is placed under the control of the Secretary of the Interior, and it gave the Secretary responsibility for preserving all timber, mineral deposits, geological wonders, and other resources within the park. The park's establishment sets a precedent for placing other natural reserves under federal jurisdiction. It's also important to note that in 1872, Indigenous people, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is under the Department of the War. Later, we're put under the Department of the Interior. And I just want to think about this. So when we are still having, quote, the Indian Wars, Indigenous folks are still fighting colonization and resisting it, we're under the Department of War. Later, after the Indian Wars are over, quote unquote, because I would argue that they're not, we're placed under the Department of Interior, the department that tracks land, fish, and wildlife. Just think on that while we're talking about this. It was funny. My husband, who is not Indigenous, in fact, his brother, they just did their 23andMe and found out they were 71% Irish, so very Irish. He had brought that to my attention. He's like, you do realize, Secretary of War, or Department of War, which is now Defense, but Interior and Fish, Wildlife, and I was like, oh my gosh, I had never really thought about that before. So something to think about as we continue to go through this. In 1874, so 2 years after Yellowstone is created, there's an expedition through the Black Hills that is led by George Armstrong Custer. And what happens in that expedition through the Black Hills? They find gold. And the Black Hills, which are part of the Great Sioux Nation for the Lakota people, they're now forced out of the Black Hills because, we found gold, and so now we need to extract that and get that. In 1876, you have the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the Battle of Greasy Grass. In 1879, the first Indigenous students enter Carlisle Indian Industrial School, one of the most notorious boarding schools in the United States. My great-grandparents went to Carlisle. In 1887, you have the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act, that is signed. The General Allotment Act takes all of the land that is in Indian country, reservation lands, so we're thinking parts of Kansas and Oklahoma, and it divides it into allotments. So each individual household, the male of each individual household, gets X amount of land allotted, and the surplus, extra land, is sold to non-native settlers. In 1890, we have the massacre that happens at Wounded Knee, where 250 unarmed Lakota elders, women, and children were massacred by the 7th Cavalry, which was also the same cavalry that was killed at Little Bighorn, that was led by George Armstrong Custer, Michigan's own. Yes, he's from Monroe, if you didn't know. In 1906, you have the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act is signed by President Theodore Roosevelt on June 8, 1906, and it grew out of a movement to protect prehistoric cliff dwellings, Pueblo ruins, and early missions in the Southwest. It authorized presidents to proclaim and reserve, quote, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest on lands owned or controlled by the United States as, quote, national monuments. It also prohibited the excavation or appropriation of antiquities on federal lands without permission from the department having jurisdiction. Nearly a quarter of the units currently in the National Park System originated in whole or part from the Antiquities Act. In 1916, we have the Act to establish the National Park Service. By August 1916, the Department of the Interior oversaw 14 national parks, 21 national monuments, and the hot springs and Casa Grande ruin reservations. Lacking this, the parks and monuments were vulnerable to competing interests. With encouragement from future directors, Stephen T. Mather and Horace Albright, the National Geographic Society, journalists, railroad interests, and others, Congress passed the Organic Act, which established the National Park Service and placed all existing parks under its management. The legislation established the basis for the National Parks Service, fundamental mission, philosophy, and policies. In 1964, you have the Wilderness Act, which is an act that Congress adopted, a policy of securing wilderness areas for the benefit of present and future generations. In 1966, you have the Historic Preservation Act, which required that all historical parks be entered into the National Registry of Historic Places. This allows us to protect them. I used to work for a tribal nation in Wisconsin and was part of getting some of our historic areas, ancestral homelands in New York, registered with the Federal Registry. It is a long process to go through, but it helps protect those lands and or structures, and it's really important. So when you're driving here in Michigan or you're going on a road trip or whatever, you see the National Registry of Historic Places. This act helped to establish that. In 1968, you have the Indian Civil Rights Act, which is signed. It is separate from any of the other civil rights acts that were signed in the 1960s. This act actually finally says that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, do apply to Indigenous people, because prior to that, it was questionable. Well, the federal government said it was questionable. Also to note, and I didn't put this on here, but I feel like I should have, in 1924, Indigenous people were actually granted citizenship to the United States. So the lands that we were born on, we were not considered citizens of until 1924. My grandfather was 11 in 1924 when the government finally said, "You're a citizen." And he also went to boarding school as well. In 1968, you also have the American Indian Movement that is founded. And then we have the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which provides protection and preservation of free-flowing condition of selected waters. In 1973, you have the Endangered Species Act, which requires federal agencies to ensure that their activities, authorized, funded, or executed, do not jeopardize the existence of any endangered or threatened species of plant or animal, including fish, or result in the destruction or deterioration of such species' critical habitat. In 1978, you have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act that is signed. That allows us as Indigenous people to actually have freedom of religion and practice our ceremonies and other religious practices that were outlawed in the later half of the 1800s. In 1979, you have the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. And then in 1990, you have the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA. NAGPRA is something that I work with almost on a daily basis as someone who works within cultural institutions. But it is a law that allows Indigenous nations, tribal nations, and to be able to work with museums to get our items of cultural sensitivity and human remains back. So I sometimes think it's weird that we had to pass a law that says you can't have human remains in your museum, but we did. And so this law allows us to reclaim our ancestors and to rebury them. It also allows us to reclaim objects and items that are culturally sensitive, or what we would deem as funerary objects. so something that was buried with said ancestor. And so this has been on the books since 1990, and actually we just had an update to it at the beginning of last year. Those updates actually went into effect this year, where they're a little bit more important to that. So this is just a timeline that shows what's going on at the same time in Indian country, when the United States is also trying to form national parks and protect the lands that ultimately were taken from Indigenous people to create these pristine areas. And so I think that that is really important to talk about. I think it's also important that we talk about the illusion of these national parks. So the national parks in the United States are built upon an illusion. The opportunity to experience the continent before colonization spoiled it is something that the parks and the landscape boast. But the, quote, untouched landscape was created by design. It wasn't natural. Indigenous folks have a history in our national parks measured in millennia. They were forcibly removed, and later treaty rights to traditional use, such as hunting and fishing, were erased, often without acknowledgement or compensation. Removal of Indigenous people from the parks gives the illusion that no one ever called these lands home, but we know that that's not true. Indigenous rights in national parks present a dilemma. The lands were wrongfully taken. Recognition of rights owing to treaties and the existence of significant cultural and religious sites or traditional use is the most equitable resource. So when I talked about the Native American Religious Freedom Act being passed, there were a number of things that were passed in that law. And one of the things that said is we could practice our ceremonies where they needed to take place. So whether that was inside of a building or whether it is inside at some of our sacred sites, which are located within some of these national parks. So as an Indigenous person, if I practice this traditional ceremony that has a sacred site within Yellowstone, that law allows me to be able to do that. But this was outlawed for a number of years. We didn't have access to these national parks, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through, and you're going to see and hopefully learn and hear and maybe remember and share with somebody the violence that happened in order to create this illusion that we see that is the national parks. So briefly, I just want to dive into the National Park Service Act and the Wilderness Act. I already touched on them a little bit, but the National Park Service Act was signed in 1916, which creates the National Park Service. So all those park rangers and those people out there, this is the act that creates that. So the purpose of the act in the national parks is to, quote, conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations, end quote. So basically, the National Park Service was formed to protect the national parks. The Indigenous people who historically inhabited the lands within the national park system for millennia received no concession, no acknowledgement, or no mention at all within this act. Indigenous people fare no better with another great conservation act, the Wilderness Act of 1964. The act was signed and opened with, quote, in order to assure that an increasing population does not occupy or modify all areas within the United States, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, end quote. The act gives the illusion that the land was previously uninhabited, unoccupied, and unmodified. The act also defines the term wilderness. Quote, a wilderness is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain, end quote. The preservation of a landscape that was seemingly void of, quote, human habitation completely disregards the long history of Indigenous use and protection of the land. And I think here it's important to note that when we are talking about the concept of climate change or environmental danger or things like that, you will find that a lot of conservation groups and environmental groups are actually looking towards indigenous traditional knowledge and wisdom. How many people have read the book Braiding Sweetgrass? Right? It's amazing, right? And there's if you haven't read it, please get it. You can get it on Audible. You can listen to it if you're more like a listener. But in that book, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the traditional use of land and how we used it to protect this. So when we have the National Park Service Act or the Wilderness Act, it's taking indigenous knowledge out of the equation. We were already protecting the lands beforehand, before colonization even happened. The Wilderness Act takes us out of the equation and doesn't acknowledge the work that we were already doing to protect said lands. So the federal law, though, also plays a role in this. So to understand the language and the laws that created the National Park Service, you have to have an understanding of the history of federal Indian law and public lands. Federal Indian law is probably the most complex form of law in the United States, and it's the least taught. I have a number of friends who have gone to law school who couldn't tell you jack about federal Indian law because they don't teach it. And it is absolutely one of the most complicated forms of law in the United States. So much of this can be traced to one single decision by the Marshall Supreme Court and the opinion written by Chief Justice John Marshall. And the court case is Johnson v. McIntosh. The opinion established that indigenous people have incomplete titles to land they inhabited for generations. It's a title of occupancy only, and ultimately European discoverers had dominion over the land and the power to grant it away regardless of indigenous occupancy. Indigenous title was also incomplete in that it was not freely alienable. The government had exclusive power to deal with the tribes and their land. Because of this, the group worked for two things to happen: the creation of the national parks and the creation of the Indian reservation system. At the same time Johnson v. McIntosh was written, Western artist George Catlin expressed the first articulation of the national park theme. Catlin was so impressed with what he saw on the Great Plains that he suggested some of it be set aside to preserve a snapshot of the American West in the early 19th century. He wanted to preserve the landscape and ultimately the people living on it. This vaguely gives off a human zoo vibe and dehumanization of indigenous people. In 1837, Washington Irving called for preservation that was, quote, an immense belt of rocky mountains and volcanic plains several hundred miles in width, end quote, which must ever remain an irreclaimable wilderness, intervening between the abodes of civilization and the affording last refuge of the Indian. Conspicuously absent from these observations is the idea that the buffalo, elk, and the American Indian could coexist with white settlement. Henry David Thoreau, an influential writer, was the last to advocate national preserves, which included native peoples. He was an admirer of, quote, Indian wisdom as it related to the landscape. Myth and romanticizing the indigenous person were part of this. So we're talking about uninhabited wilderness, and what is this concept of uninhabited wilderness? This picture is a picture I took when I was in the Catskills. Can't even remember. I feel like it was a few years ago. And I'm standing on the porch of Thomas Cole's house, and Thomas Cole is the founder of the Hudson River School of Painting. His home is in the Catskills, beautiful home. And he was a beautiful painter. And so you stand on his front porch, you can look out, and you can see what he would describe as uninhabited wilderness. Except my ancestors were living in that uninhabited wilderness. And so with this idea of what we're talking about this. So thinking had changed by the time the parks began to be created, beginning with Yellowstone in 1872. No longer were the parks used to preserve an uninhabited landscape. Instead, they were a pleasuring ground for people, a preserved landscape that had not known the hand of humanity, except it did. Writers such as John Muir perhaps naturally felt that preserving nature and human occupation were incompatible. Muir's writings are an excellent example of how far removed indigenous people had become from their landscapes for the early 20th century preservationists. When visiting Glacier National Park once, he saw Indigenous guides as ignorant and superstitious. He believed humans should connect with nature spiritually through observation. His views of Indigenous people around Yosemite were nothing short of disdainful. In his extended essay, The Mountains of California, of the 16 chapters, none are devoted to the Indigenous person still living near the park. In the most telling chapter, Muir, having climbed a pass where, quote, in every direction the landscape stretched sublimely away in fresh wilderness, a manuscript written by the hand of nature alone, end quote, encounters a group of mono-Indigenous people traveling the same trail. He notes both men and women persistently begged for whiskey and tobacco and were most ugly, and some of them altogether hideous, having no proper place in the landscape. Samuel Bowles, an influential advocate of both the national park system and reservations, saw the two as incompatible. The parks were to be the pleasure ground and health home of the nation. In contrast, the Indigenous people he advocated removing from these places were doomed to extinction, and thus the reservations would, quote, smooth and make decent the pathway to the Indian's grave, end quote. Despite late 19th and early 20th century writers or an ideal peer of wilderness being uninhabited, considerable effort was put into the argument that many Western parks had never been used by Indigenous people, and therefore there wasn't any removal that was happening. They were never there, so we're not really removing anyone. This was most notable in Yellowstone, the park, not the TV show, where people claim that Indigenous people never used the park due to having superstitions about the geothermal features. Similarly, Indigenous people were supposed to not have used the area near Mount Rainier and the interior of the Olympic Peninsula due to an unspecified, quote, fear of spirits. The idea park lands were useless to Indians can be found in the cession negotiations between the government and the Blackfeet Nation over Eastern Glacier National Park. So what's the perception here? The visions between Muir and Caitlin held firm in the psyche of the nation. The shift in thinking depeopled the landscape, not just with removal from the lands, but also from the minds of the general public. In less than a century, conservation advocates had gone from viewing the Indian people inhabiting lands they wished to save as critical, even admirable component, to viewing the Indian inhabitants as a blight on the landscape of true wilderness. So the thinking went from, we should let these people be in their lands and live in their lands, to, oh my gosh, we have to get them out of here. This is just not good for business. Several decades of relative peace, armed conflict between Western Indian tribes and American settlers and the United States Army became frequent from the mid-1850s through the 1870s. This increase in hostilities may be because the American westward expansion was accelerating. The goal was to people the West with non-native settlers. There was no longer a place for the American Indian in America, even in the most remote reaches of the West. And Caitlin's idea for a peopled national park was doomed. The depth of racism toward Indigenous people during this period may be seen in an action by President Ulysses S. Grant. In 1874, 2 years after signing the act to create Yellowstone, Grant pocket vetoed a congressional bill outlawing bison killing. Grant would have seen the remnants of the bison herds hunted to extinction, so long as the Western tribes would starve as a result. Given this context, it comes as no surprise that Indigenous tribes received no consideration when Yellowstone was being created. So there's a lot. There's federal Indian law, there's treaty law, there's this creation of the national parks, there's this national perspective of Indigenous people not being people, and this deliberate attempt to get rid of Indigenous people. And just by that act alone, the pocket veto alone, to prevent the killing of the bison, the main food source for the tribes in the West, is a deliberate act to get rid of us. How are we going to solve this Indian problem. And so what I want to talk to you in just the last few slides is about a few of the national parks. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a lot, but I'm going to go through a few. One of which I have been to, two of which I'm supposed to try to go to, but I just want, and we're going to go a little bit out of order. I am going to talk about Yellowstone, but we're not going to talk about Yellowstone first. That would make sense because it was the first one created. But the first one we're actually going to talk about is Teddy Roosevelt National Park. Why? Because he was so gung-ho about conservation and protection of the land. And I have been to Teddy Roosevelt National Park, so I feel like I can talk about this one and not feel I can tell you like what it felt like to be on the land and to be there. If you don't know where it's at, the entrance that I went into, which I think is the north entrance, is in a little town called Medora, North Dakota. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the southern gateway. My bad. Medora, North Dakota. And I'm going to tell you something. We were staying in Medora, North Dakota. We got there, my husband and I, we got there, and, we check into our hotel, and it's like 90 degrees outside, because we were dumb, and we went in August. And so it was 90 degrees outside, but it cooled off as the sun was going down, and we went to a little diner that was down the street. I had the best omelet I have ever had in my life in Medora, North Dakota, and our waitress was from Michigan, and I was like, this is a sign. So I just, little piece of history, so just thought I would tell you that. So Medora is the southern gateway to Teddy Roosevelt National Park. Roosevelt went to the Dakota Territory in 1883 to hunt the bison. In 1884, he went back home to New York. His wife gave birth to their daughter, Alice. And unbeknownst to her doctors, his wife had a kidney ailment and died on Valentine's Day that year. Teddy's mother also died the same day, in the same year, just at a different house. So it was a very traumatic moment. So he goes back out west, and he built a ranch outside of Medora, intent on letting nature soothe him. That little ranch house he built is still standing, by the way. He didn't last long out there. The West never became his permanent home, but it left a mark on him, and in return, he left his mark on it. Roosevelt was familiar with Indigenous people, having interacted with them in the Dakota Territory. Quote, "The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian," end quote. Direct quote from Teddy Roosevelt, who's on Mount Rushmore in the middle of the Black Hills. Just saying. He would say in an 1886 speech, during which he famously declared, quote, "I don't go as far as to think the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th." So he was no fan of the Indigenous person. In 1903, Roosevelt himself let himself be drawn back west. In April that year, he embarked on a 14,000-mile train journey that took him through 24 states and territories in 9 weeks. He traveled to Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, in California, enjoying a 3-night camping trip with John Muir. Along the way, he gave speeches at the Grand Canyon, at Yellowstone, where he laid the cornerstone for the Roosevelt Arch near some redwoods in Santa Cruz. Roosevelt translated his passion into policy during his time in office. He created 150 national forests, 18 national monuments, 5 national parks, 4 national game preserves, and 51 bird reservations. So he did a lot. But he also wanted us gone. Just saying. But it is a beautiful place. If you've never been, I recommend you going. I think one of my favorite parts, because, I grew up in the city, so, I didn't really go, to nature that often. And when we were out there, I saw free-range horses, which was so cool. I saw the bison, and then we were looking at this one field, and they were free-roaming bison, not like they do in Yellowstone, but they were there, and we came upon this one field, and there were these bison eating the grass, and popping up from the ground were these little prairie dogs making their little prairie dog noises, and it was the funniest thing to me to see these little prairie dogs and these giant bison, and then there was I will say one of my most fondest memories of that trip that we took to Teddy Roosevelt is The hotel that we were staying at was across the street from the entrance, and so you could look up and you could see the bluffs and the plateaus, and there was a storm that was rolling in, and you could see it there's nothing like watching a storm roll in when you're out west. It was the most amazing thing I saw. And then in the middle of it all, me being just the way I am, I look at my husband and I'm like, are the bison going to be okay? And he says, I think they're going to be fine. And I'm like, all right, I'm just double checking. I didn't know. I still do that now. I'm so weird. But it's totally fine. So quickly, I want to talk about Yellowstone National Park. And before you ask, yes, I have watched the television show. Yes, it is my guilty pleasure. It's fine. So ours and the world's first national park was created by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1872, just about 100 years after the creation of the United States and after the fight to keep our union together. This early date makes Yellowstone unique as it predates the last armed conflicts between indigenous peoples and the military in the American West. In 1869, the first official expedition of the region was done, and in 1871, Ferdinand V. Hayden led an expedition sponsored by the government and produced professional sketches and photos. So in 1872, Grant signs the Yellowstone Act, creating the first national park, and with a stroke of a pen, the indigenous inhabitants of the land were now trespassers. Yellowstone received national attention in 1877 when the Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, crossed the park pursued by 2,000 soldiers. The Nez Perce hoped to reach Canada after having just been removed from their homelands in the Walla Valley. They tried to avoid white people on their way, however, they were attacked near the Bog Hole River in August of 1877 by command of Colonel John Gibbons, who was at the Battle of Little Bighorn. They made their way towards the Nez Perce camp, killing a man during their advance, and then began firing into the teepees, killing sleeping men, women, and children. The Nez Perce did eventually fight back and defended themselves well, but they lost 60 people. Fresh off this battle, they entered the park and encountered tourists reeling at what they were seeing. They briefly held tourists as hostages, released them, but later killed 2 tourists in the park later that month. The Crow, Shoshone, and Bannock frequented Yellowstone as long as they had during the park's early years. But because of fears of what might happen during the beginnings of the park's history, the park's headquarters resembled a military fort. Fear of Indians, and more specifically, fear of the effect of the word of Indian troubles would have on tourism, seems to have been a constant concern during Yellowstone's first years. So inevitably what happens is the indigenous people are banned from Yellowstone. They're banned from being able to go to their homelands and pursue their hunting or fishing rights, or even just camping or holding ceremony. And this goes on for a number of years. In July of 1895, when pressure from park officials and Indian agents proved inadequate, a Jackson Hole area lawman, William Manning, decided on a violent approach to, quote, get the matter to the courts. With a posse of 26, he discovered a Bannock encampment and confiscated their teepees, saddles, horses, rifles, and elk meat. The Bannocks were arrested and marched out at gunpoint for violating Wyoming's gaming laws. As the procession neared a heavily forested area, Manning told his posse to unload their weapons. Some of the Bannock bolted in fear, an older man was killed, and 2 children were lost. While tribal leaders were outraged, there were promises made to punish crimes committed by white settlers. Judge John Reiner out of Jackson Hole concluded that treaty rights to off-reservation hunting of 1868 trumped the laws of Wyoming, which became a state in 1890. The victory was short-lived when on May 25, 1896, the Supreme Court reversed that decision in the case Ward v. Racehorse. The court found that Congress had and could terminate the treaty rights in question by admitting Wyoming as a state. While limited Indian use of Yellowstone continued in secret, the Racehorse decision had ended any chance of Indian peoples being able to accept or exercise their treaty hunting rights in the park at all. Then we have Glacier. The original Blackfeet Reservation covered 2/3 of the part of the state of Montana that is east of the Continental Divide. The Rockies were viewed as their spiritual and physical homelands. As disease and decimation of the bison weakened the Blackfeet, their reservation, like many others, was reduced in size. By 1880, it consisted of the current reservation plus the eastern half of modern Glacier Park. The government suspected the region's mountains contained mineral wealth. In 1895, the United States dispatched 3 commissioners led by George Bird Grinnell to negotiate the purchase of the mountain lands on the western side of the reservation. Grinnell was the founder of the Audubon Society of New York, and he accompanied Custer in 1874 expedition in the Black Hills that resulted in gold being discovered. The commissioners offered a small sum of $1 million. The Blackfeet did not want to sell. However, after a harsh winter where 600 Blackfeet died, the tribe signed away the land that would become Glacier National Park. Eventually, the land was sold for $1.5 million, which, according to a modern day judge, was, quote, plainly an adhesion negotiation. However, hunting, fishing, and timber cutting rights were expressly reserved for, quote, so long as the same shall remain on public lands of the United States. The agreement was bitterly accepted on behalf of the tribe by Chief Whitecalf, who stated, quote, Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. The mountains have been my last refuge. As it turned out, the lands ceded did not have significant mineral value. As he had hoped all along, Grinnell was able to form a coalition that successfully pushed for the creation of Glacier National Park in 1910. This bill creating Glacier did not mention the Blackfeet reserved rights. As early as February 1912, a park ranger arrested Blackfeet people for hunting in the park, warning them that, quote, they will no longer be permitted in Glacier National Park. They will be summarily ejected if found within the park, end quote. From that time forward, hunting and fishing rights in the park have been denied to the Blackfeet. At the same time, the Park Service was denying Blackfeet treaty rights. So, hotel entrepreneur Lewis Hill, owner of the Great Northern Railroad, began employing Blackfeet as hosts in his hotel. These, quote, Glacier Park Indians were widely used by the tourism industry and the Park Service to promote the park. So, beautiful spaces, absolutely beautiful spaces, tragic history in the way that they are formed. But I will say that in 2025, at least I'm hoping it's still going to be this way, the National Park Service has started to create a relationship with tribal nations. It's called a co-management project where the national parks are working with the tribal nations as, whose land that the park is on, and trying to create a co-stewardship or a co-management of the park. Because who are better stewards of the national park than those of us that have been stewarding them for millennia? And so I do think that that's actually really interesting, and I think that could lead to a lot of really great things. At least I'm hopeful for it. And usually what I do at the end of these presentations is I give you a slide at the end that, tells you, if you want more information, read these books or watch this documentary. But for this one, I felt like I wanted to do something a little different. So what I'm doing is I'm leaving you with a question that you don't have to answer here, you're not going to be graded on. But what can we do to make sure people know that these beautiful parks are the homes of Indigenous people? So when you're hiking through Yellowstone, or you're watching a storm roll in Teddy Roosevelt, and you're wondering what's going to happen to the bison, or you're at Glacier, you're riding in on the Amtrak train to the Glacier, or you're at the Grand Canyon, what as people who enjoy these beautiful spaces, and we want you to enjoy the beautiful spaces. I don't want you to leave here thinking I'm telling you don't go to national parks. They're, bad. No, go to the parks. They're beautiful. But what can you do that lets people know that the road that you are traveling was once traveled by Indigenous people? So that is my challenge to you as we embark. Let's see, it's May, right? So people are going to start going to the national parks and they're going to start road tripping and doing all this really cool stuff. So as we embark on this tourist season, what can you do to make sure that people know whose land that they are on and the price that needed to be paid in order for us to enjoy these beautiful places? So I'm going to say this now before I forget, but thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for challenging yourself to maybe hear a different narrative. And I appreciate that so much, more than you know. It's one of my favorite things to do is I love to just present new sides to the history. Make the story fuller. That's my favorite thing to do, is to make the story fuller. And so I'm going to say thank you to you now. And we have a few minutes for a couple questions, but I really appreciate you guys coming out. You've made my heart full, so thank you so much. And you can't ask me a question that offends me because I have heard it all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a beautiful question. And if you couldn't hear, she was asking about having Indigenous guides at the parks to be able to talk about the history. I know some parks do actually do that. There's a conscious effort in some areas. I will tell you, at Mount Rushmore, they do have Indigenous guides, and also at the battlefield for Little Bighorn. I remember I was there 2 years ago. My husband and I decided we were going to drive across the country, and so we stopped at that place. Again, it was August. I don't know why I'm going to these places when it's so hot, but there were Indigenous guides that were there that talk about the lands, but also the battle itself, and give the Indigenous side of what happened. So there is an effort to make that happen, and so I do think that that's something that the National Park Service is actively working towards. But great question. Mm-hmm. That I don't know if they do that for every single one of the brochures, but I have seen it in some. But that's a really good question. Thank you. What other questions, comments, concerns? Yes, sir.
Is there a plan to name new national parks with Indigenous names?
I don't think there is, but there should be. So I know some monuments. Yes, monuments have changed. So we have Denali, which was formerly Mount McKinley. And Denali is I believe it's an Inuit word. But there are Indigenous place names that are coming back up because that was its original name. So there is that. I don't know about like broader national parks in general, but I do know monuments it's happened with. Yeah, great question though. Any other questions, comments, concerns? What you're having for dinner? What you're doing this weekend? Yes. Can you repeat the first part? Yeah, so in recent years, so in modern history, like the 80s and the 90s, there was a big push for a revival of treaty rights, to have those fishing rights, to have the hunting rights. And just so you're aware, anytime we make a treaty, that's a legal contract. It doesn't matter if it was made in 1763 or 2025. It has to be honored. There is no expiration date. So in the treaties that do mention hunting and fishing rights, those were challenged a lot in the 80s and 90s by tribal nations who were trying to get them to court so the courts could uphold it, and the tribes were always successful in being able to uphold those parts of the treaties. Yes? Yeah, absolutely. So there is a big movement, if you are familiar with the land back movement. It's a big movement that was launched in 2020. I would say land back has been around since colonization started, but in 2020 there was a huge push for the land back movement when the current president was running for re-election in 2020. He held a rally in the Black Hills, which is sacred to the Lakota people, which were stolen by the federal government when gold was discovered. And so the point of the land back movement was to say, hey, the Black Hills need to be returned because they were promised to us, guaranteed to us in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie to the Lakota people. And gold was discovered, and so they were taken away. And so that kind of was a big push to that. Land back has since been, so the Black Hills still have not been returned, even though the Supreme Court has ruled that they were wrongly taken. And you can learn about that actually in the Lakota Nation versus the United States. It's a really good documentary. I think it's on Hulu. But since then, land back has happened at the federal level, state level, county level, and private level, so private ownership of land being returned back to Indigenous nations. So it is happening. And in fact, New York, state of New York, returned 1,000 acres back to the Onondaga people, and that was a state park. And so they returned land back to the Onondaga people because they were like, you're right, this was part of your treaty, sorry. So they're doing it. But of course, there had to be push that was happening. So it is happening. I don't necessarily know that we would see it at a national park level, but I do think if we can get more of this co-management and co-stewardship happening, we might see more relationship building happening. But great question. Appreciate that. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? Yes, ma'am. Last one. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes and no. If your casino is, it's like any business. If it's not successful, it's not going to help you. But if it is successful, it will definitely help you. But it varies, and not every single tribal nation has a casino. That's not like, yeah. Some are, absolutely some are. Mhm. Mhm. There are, so if a tribal nation has, if a federally recognized tribe has a reservation in a state, and that state allows gambling, and so they have a casino, there is an agreement made between the tribal nation and the state. There's like an annuity payment that's paid every year to the state. They suspended those payments during COVID because everybody was struggling during COVID. And I worked for a tribal nation during COVID and was laid off for 9 weeks while we were trying to, contain and keep everybody safe. But after that, the annuity payments started back up again. So if you are a tribal nation in a state that has a casino, you have a contract with the state, and then they work out. I don't know exactly how it works, but I know there is an agreement in place. Yep. Cool. Thank you guys for, one last question. Yes, I would say that in a very weird way. I think George Catlin, he advocated for Indigenous people to still be in the land, but then when, it got too hard to have that, he was like, oh, well, we should just get rid of them. And also, I mentioned it at the very beginning, but the Dawes Act, which is the General Allotment Act, Henry Dawes was a senator from Massachusetts. He was on the Indian Appropriations Committee, and he genuinely thought allotting land was beneficial because it was helping the Indigenous person assimilate into an agrarian way of living. So if they have this plot of land, they're going to farm. And if they become farmers, that's a noble profession. And it is. I love farmers. And you're going to, like, stop wearing moccasins and you're going to change the way you're dressing. So in his heart of hearts, everything I read about Henry Dawes, he legitimately thought he was helping. He just didn't understand the ramifications of what he was doing and how it was actually hurting. So there was in his heart, I will give him credit, in his heart he thought he was helping, but it was causing way more harm than before. But yeah. All right, it is 8:01. You guys have a beautiful evening. Thank you for coming out. I appreciate it.